Today, I'm going to talk about some things I'd like to see from Nikon for landscape photographers. So today I wanted to take some time to talk about some things I'd like to see from Nikon for landscape photographers. Now the Nikon Z8 is out and it seems to be a pretty amazing camera, but I don't really feel it's the right fit for me as a landscape photographer. And I'll touch on some of those reasons a little later in the video, as well as some things I would like to see in the next camera body from Nikon for landscape photographers. So I'm a long-time Nikon user and I'm pretty happy with my camera bodies that I have now. I currently shoot mainly with a Nikon Z7 II for my landscape photography, and I'm really pretty happy with it. And I think that's one of the reasons that enticing me into a camera body upgrade is sort of difficult, because I'm happy with what I have. There's some minor annoyances. I've talked about it in previous videos. We'll touch on some today. But with that said, there are some things I think Nikon can do to help existing Nikon users. For example, people like me with a Z7 II or a Z7 or a Z6, Z6 II, Z5, any of the Z series cameras. I think there's some things they could do today to help build that customer loyalty. And we'll talk a little bit about what I would like to see in the next camera body to help entice me to upgrade in the future. So keep in mind as we go through this video, this is purely based on me being a landscape photographer. This doesn't dive into wildlife photography, where they might have different needs and requirements and things they would like to see, or why maybe the Z8 or Z9 would be more enticing. And it doesn't dive into anything like portrait work, headshot work, or event work, where some of the features in a Z8 or Z9 may be very attractive to them. I'm basing this video purely on Nikon for landscape photographers and some of the things I would like to see, both for existing users and in the future, to entice me to upgrade. So let's talk about current Nikon users. Those are people like me and probably lots of followers on this channel, people that already use Nikon cameras. There's a lot of Nikon mirrorless users out there doing landscape photography. And there are a few things I think they could do to help us out, since we're already owners of the equipment. And why should they do this? Well, I think it just shows good customer support, and it helps keep bringing people back to the brand, and it helps make people more loyal to the brand, and it just helps us out doing what we want to do every day out in the field. There's certain annoyances that I believe could be fixed in firmware that would be relatively easy to push out, that would help make Nikon an even more attractive system to photographers. And there's a couple key points that I have that I would like to see fixed in firmware that I think Nikon should address. I think continual firmware updates is something that can really help build confidence in a camera brand and the camera that you've chosen to use for your pursuit of the hobby. And to be fair, Nikon does push out some firmware updates, so that's one of the things. I'm not really asking to do something that they aren't already doing. They already push out firmware updates occasionally for most of the systems I have, and I do get some firmware updates that bring little tweaks to autofocus and things like that. But there's a couple key features that I have to believe would be very easy to do, which would be great for landscape photographers. So I'm going to touch on a few of those. Now, I'm sure some have a laundry list of things they'd like to see fixed in their firmware. They're as equally easy and would be as equally beneficial to landscape photographers. But I'm just going to touch on some of the things that affect me, that are at top of my mind, and some of the ones I more commonly hear other Nikon users mention to me when I'm out in the field. So this is the first one that jumps to mind. There's the ability to choose the image area on the Nikon mirrorless cameras. By default, it shoots a 3:2 mirrorless digital full frame aspect ratio. Now, a lot of people, post-editing, they'll crop to like a 5:4 ratio, or even sometimes a 16:9 ratio or something like that. Now, a lot of cameras give you the ability to preview this and see what you're going to see on the back of the screen with that ratio. Take the picture and you can sort of make your compositions a little better. Now, Nikon has this feature underneath the choose image area menu option, but when you choose, say, the 5:4 format, it works great for composing your image. But the problem is when you take the picture, it actually only shoots that crop. It bends the pixels that are outside of that. So you lose the full 3:2 aspect ratio, because once you've switched it to 5:4, it changes that image area and it just deletes those pixels. It's not there. A lot of camera brands, when you change it to like a 5:4 ratio, you're still going to have the full image. Just helps with composition, but if you change your mind after the fact and want the 3:2, you'll have it. What happens a lot of times is you'll make the setting change because you want to get an idea of the composition, forget to change it back, and now everything you've shot is in 5:4 aspect ratio instead of 3:2. So it's really just sort of annoying, and there's really no reason that they can't show me the 5:4 preview on the back of the screen, but when I take the picture, keep those pixels so that when I get it home, I can have the 3:2 option if I want, or I can stick with the 5:4 as I shot it. This would be something super easy to fix in the firmware. Release that update, and I think it would go a long way to be a little less frustrating for landscape photographers, where sometimes we switch between that 5:4 format or a 16:9 format or a 3:2 and be able to get that preview without losing those pixels. The other one that comes up really doesn't affect me directly because I'm on a Z6 II or Z7 II predominantly, but for the users of the Z6 and Z7, a lot of landscape photographers want sort of a clean live view. So what a clean live view is, when you're looking at the back of the LCD, you know, if you follow my recommendation, you've got the histogram going, you've got your camera settings, you've got a lot of information around that display. Well, if you're trying to just perfectly line up some composition, sometimes that screen information can get in the way. Maybe you can't quite tell, is that rock in or out of the frame? There's something sticking in from here because information on the display is getting in the way. Well, in the Nikon Z7 II and Z6 II, you can press the record button and it'll give you a clean view, and it makes it really handy to get that clean look at your composition so you can tweak it just right. Now in the Z6 and the Z7, that same feature doesn't work. It's only a feature on the Mark II. That is an example of one of those super easy things to fix in the firmware. It's literally just pulling information off the display. Firmware for the newer versions can already do it. I think that's something they should trickle down to the Z7 and Z6 because it's just a simple fix, makes life less frustrating, and adds additional value to a camera you've already purchased. It's things like that I'd like to see Nikon do through firmware updates. A lot of times it's just trickling down a small feature from one of the more advanced systems, or as they learn more about their own systems and what people like, you can sort of incrementally improve that firmware, and I think Nikon should do that more often. Now those are my top 2 firmware fixes that I'd like to see Nikon release. Like I said, I'm sure other people have other things they'd like to see, little minor annoyances, repositioning of the menus, all little things that could be fixed through firmware. But some of the other things I'd like to see, and they do push some autofocus updates through, and this does get more complicated as you change hardware. The processors in one system might be faster than others. So something in a Z9 might have the faster processors that some of the older cameras just, they don't have the horsepower to do. And I get that. If you don't have the horsepower, that's it. But if there's these little small tweaks, for example, things about focusing in low light, if the camera can support it as they learn something from the Z8 or the Z9, I would love to see some of that trickle back down into, say, the Z7 II, and if it's possible, into the Z7. Again, I get it, the hardware can change, the newer systems are faster, they have more processing power to be able to handle some more advanced autofocusing, low light things, but when the possibility is there and the hardware can support it, I'd like to see some of that come back to the older systems, just again, to really help make the camera have more value for you and make it a better investment for your landscape photography. So again, those are things I would like to see in the firmware. I'd love to hear down in the comments below from the Nikon users, what would you like to see fixed in the firmware, updated in the firmware? If Nikon would listen to you, what would you like to see? What could be updated? So drop some comments down below and let me hear what you'd like to see in the Nikon firmware updates. Okay, so moving away from firmware, let's move into the hardware, the actual physical camera bodies. Like I said, I passed on the Z9 and I'm passing on the Z8. Well, I'm excited to see Nikon have some of these flagship cameras with these awesome features. The Z8 it does seem to be a very impressive camera. There are certain features I'd love to see and love to have, but when it comes to the price, to the value I think I would actually get out of those features, it's not quite there yet. So one of the biggest reasons I'm passing on the Z9 for sure, and pretty much the Z8 as well, is just the size of the camera. I mean, take the Z9 for instance, it has the integrated grip on there and it just makes the thing a beast. It's a big camera. And for someone like me that's predominantly a landscape photographer, carrying my camera gear into weird places, down steep descents, up steep climbs, I'm really trying to get the advantage of mirrorless being a smaller, lighter camera than some of the DSLRs out there. And the Z9 was just a completely step in the wrong direction for that, and even though it was potentially within my price range, just the size of it, I really didn't care what it could do, I didn't want to carry that beast out into the field. So then comes the Z8, which did make some improvements. It's still a bigger camera body though than like the Z7 II or Z6 II. And because of that, again, I don't want to carry a lot of weight into the field. One of the things I like about the Nikon Z7 II is that it's a relatively compact size for a full frame camera. It's not gigantic, it doesn't weigh a ton, and it's a pretty portable form factor while getting benefits of full frame and Nikon reliability. So really, size is one of the big things with the Z8. It's still just too big. So I've looked at them in the camera shop and compared them to a Z7 II and a Z6 II, and it's just too big. I just don't want to lug it through the trails and the areas I go out and practice landscape photography in. And beyond size, there is a little bit of price sensitivity to it. While the Z9, really, probably no price would make me want to buy it just because the size is that problematic to me. The Z8's right there on the cusp of maybe it's not too big, maybe I could get used to carrying it, maybe I could lighten up the load somewhere else. But for the extra features it brings to the table, for a landscape photographer, I don't see there being enough value there to warrant the cost of that camera. My Z7 II does pretty much everything I need it to do, want it to do, at a better price point, and you factor in the size and weight of it, and the Z7 II is just a great camera for me. So really, between size and in me just not seeing the feature enhancements in the Z8, Z9 being worth the price for the type of photography I do. So if I'm passing on those, what am I looking for in the next Nikon body? What am I looking at? We're going to call it the Nikon Z7 II, though there's some speculation of maybe the Z8 is going to replace the 7, and the 6 series is what's going to advance more and become a Z6 III. Let's call it a Z7 III. I'm not really too picky about what the name is. Let's just sort of focus on the features that I would be looking for that might convince me to upgrade camera bodies within the Nikon camera system. So first up, the things I would steal from the Nikon Z8, the sensor shield. Anyone that's been listening to this channel knows I've had to clean my sensor more than I ever have with my old DSLRs because there's no sensor shield. When you're doing a lens change, the sensor is just exposed. So as a landscape photographer, I'm outdoors in wind, dust, dirt, rain. So it's hard to make a lens change in a safe, comfortable, controlled environment. Therefore, I get lots of dust spots. I have to do a lot of dust spot cleaning post-processing or a lot of cleaning of my sensor, and that's just very annoying. Z8 has a sensor shield. I would love to see that come to the Z7 III, and that would actually be a feature that's pretty high up on my list. Next up, stealing from the Z8, the two-way tilt screen. So on the Nikon, we can tilt landscape-wise, no problem, right? We can tilt, we can get the cameras up high, look at it, put the camera down low, flip it up. Piece of cake, super simple, always works. However, once we turn to portrait mode, I have no tilt. So if I set the camera really, really low, it is super hard to see my composition. Now I've had people on the channel suggest using the phone and Bluetooth to it, but really it just gets finicky and it's just another piece of equipment in my way when I'm out in the field. So the Z8 has a two-way tilt screen, so you can tilt the normal way, like that, get your tilts like that. And it allows you to tilt when you're in portrait mode up and down. That to me would be a great feature. I'm getting older. I don't like to climb down on the ground quite as much, but I do like those low compositions. So being able to have that two-way tilt would be super cool. So I'd love to see that feature come to the next camera body in, say, the Z7 series. So the last feature is the Starlight View that I'd like to see come to a future system borrowed from the Z8. Essentially what that is allows autofocus detection to 9 stops underexposed. So because landscape photographers are out there a lot for sunrises, sunsets, it can get dark pretty quickly. And if you're trying to focus in and use the autofocus to focus in on some ridge or some rock off in the distance in low light conditions, being able to have that extra autofocus ability in low light conditions would be super useful. So that is a feature I would like to see come from the Z8 to, say, a Nikon Z7 III. So those are the 3 things that I consider almost must-haves in a future camera body that I would want it to have to get me to upgrade to it from my Z7 II. The sensor shield, the two-way tilt screen, and sort of that Starlight View to help with that autofocus in low light conditions. Now there are a couple nice-to-haves, things I think would be nice to have in an updated camera body, but they aren't necessarily make or break. They just sort of be like icing on the cake. And the first one is eliminated main buttons. The Z8 has buttons that eliminate, and it's typically the main ones, the ones down here on the back of the camera. Not all of them eliminate, but I think that would be sort of useful, handy for when you're out in those low light conditions. For the most part, I have my buttons fairly well memorized. It'd be sort of a nice to have just for when you're out, just, you know, allow me to be the lazy photographer a little more. And then the other one is the display has a warm display, so it sort of protects your night vision, gives it more of a red hue instead of a bright blue light view or something like that. So again, a nice to have. I don't do a ton of astrophotography where that's quite as crucial, where you're really trying to protect that night vision. But some of those sunrises, sunsets, especially when I'm waiting to get set up for sunrise, it might be nice to have that warm display view. So that'd be sort of a nice to have. If it's not in a future one, I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep over it, but I think it'd be sort of cool to have. And then if we get into just the camera physical size, there's a couple things I mentioned. One of the things that keep me away from the Z8, Z9 is the weight and size of the camera body itself. I'd really rather the next version not be any bigger than the current Nikon Z7. I don't think it's too problematic. It's pretty thin, fits in my pack well, not too bad. Now there's probably some room they could make some weight improvements, maybe a little more carbon fiber in the camera body, a little less magnesium alloy, whatever makes sense to give me a slightly lighter camera body but still be super strong to handle being tossed around in the pack or maybe falling on a rock or something like that. I don't want to lose durability, but there's probably some rooms and some technology improvements to sort of lower the weight. If it went down, that would be welcomed. Again, that's not a make or break one for me. It would be just a super nice to have if it got a little lighter in weight. But again, if it's not there, as long as it doesn't get bigger or heavier than what I currently have, I'll be pretty good. So beyond the camera body size and weight, the other little area I think camera manufacturers should play around in more is the dynamic range. How much dynamic range can we capture from the dark side to the highlight side? And let's try to get that expanded. Our eyes can see so much more dynamic range than our cameras can. That's where I'd like to see a bump in technology, is see that dynamic range increase a little more. So when you're photographing those high contrast, high dynamic range sunrises, sunsets, or maybe even dark shadowy waterfalls with a brighter light, try to get it so I can capture even more in a single frame so I don't have to exposure bracket anymore. That would be a feature that I would like to see and see where the technology continues to develop and improve. Dynamic range. So those are the features I would sort of be looking for in the next camera body. Those are just the ones that come top of mind. I mean, hopefully Nikon is out there innovating, got our R&D department coming out with some new features I haven't even thought to mention yet that would be completely awesome for a landscape photographer, and I would welcome those. But those are the ones that currently today I would be looking at, and ones I would like to see announced in, say, the Nikon Z7 III. So now there's probably one thing I've left out, sort of the elephant in the room, and that is the number of megapixels. Megapixels is always what some people on the internet talk about. They want a camera with more megapixels, more megapixels, more megapixels. And that's great, but I'm actually in the camp that I don't really feel like I need more megapixels right now. My Nikon Z7 II is shooting at 45.7 megapixels, and I really feel like even for my obsessive cropping disorder where I like to crop in on things, or sometimes pretty radically, I feel like I have enough pixels to play with and work with that I don't really need more pixels out in the field. But for the moment, that's just not something that's attractive to me. I feel like my 45.7 is just fine. I would be totally content to buy a new camera body with that same level of megapixel, and I really don't feel like I need to go more. And some of that is because there are some cons for increased megapixels. You can get more noise at higher ISOs with the increase in megapixels, so images can get a little more noisy, and the higher megapixel can be more demanding on the lenses. You can really start to highlight some flaws in the image quality of some of the lesser expensive lenses. So if you start to make that drive up in megapixels, you start to really put more pressure to have super high image quality in your lenses. Image quality is always great, but when you're starting to force it because of the number of megapixels, when really a 45 megapixels is probably doing okay. And finally, it gets a little more demanding on technique. When you've got those high resolution cameras, you end up not being able to handhold quite as much, or even a little bit of movement that might not quite get picked up on a lower megapixel camera is going to get picked up on the higher megapixel camera. A little bit of breeze through the grass, breeze through the trees. You start to move yourself to either needing a really solid hand-holding technique or needing to use the tripod more often. And again, I'm just not really looking to go forward towards that. So to me, I feel like increased megapixels do come with cons. It's not a free upgrade, and I'm just not feeling like I'm pushing the limit on the current megapixels I have. So I don't mention that. I don't really want to see an increase in megapixels. If it comes, as long as it's not crazy, like we get maybe 63, 65, not going to be a deal breaker, but I don't need to see crazy high megapixels. I don't really look at that as part of the equation in the upgrade decision. And that really pretty much sums it up for things I'd like to see from Nikon for the landscape photographer. I don't have a huge list of things I really want to see, and I think a lot of that comes because I really think the Z7 II is a very solid camera. Some of the things I don't like about it are just nitpicks or just mild inconveniences, so I don't have a ton that I'd like to see. Hopefully Nikon continues to do R&D and push the envelope and make things better, and they'll come up with some feature that I didn't even know to ask for because I didn't even know it was on the radar. But for the most part, the things I covered, those are the big things I'd like to see. And if the Z7 III, or if they switch over to where the Z6 III is going to become more of that Z7, then if it includes those features, that would probably be my next camera body. But again, it makes it really hard to want something more when I feel like the Nikon Z7 II is a great camera. So hopefully you found this video useful. I doubt any of this makes it to Nikon and changes anything they do, but we can always wish, and I feel like it's something important for avid users of your camera brand. Comment on what do you want to see? What do you want your camera brand to do? What would keep you a happy customer? What keeps you from looking at other cameras? So I think it's important to talk about these things, whether it really makes a difference to the manufacturer or not. I think it's important to talk about. So how about you? If you're a Nikon user, let me know. What would you like to see in the next Nikon body? And if you're not a Nikon user, regardless of system, you're going to be in the same spot as I am. You're going to have those little nitpicks, things you'd like to see. What would you like to see? Tell me about that megapixel comment. Like, I don't think we need more. Do you think we need more? Let's hear about it down in the comments and let's talk about it. So again, if you liked today's video, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you for watching.